When The Shape of Water was released in 2017, it seems it was in equal parts hailed as a cinematic triumph and roasted to oblivion on the internet. Despite its acclaim and accolades, including the Oscar for Best Picture, I think the lasting impression the film left on mainstream audiences can be summed up as that movie where a lady bangs a fish guy. And so, while mostly equipped with this comically condensed summary, it seems most people didn't vibe with it or even felt it didn't deserve its awards. Listen, if this movie isn't for you, I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. Art is subjective, we can like different things, it's no big deal. But I'd still like to make a case for why this film should be given a fair shot by the average moviegoer. And it's not just because of its gorgeous physical sets, practical effects, and phenomenal actors, all of which goes without saying. But I still feel the heart of it has gone largely underappreciated. And heart is the operative word here. Sincerity goes a long way, and I think we could use a little bit more of it these days. So in this video, which will have spoilers by the way, I want to explore how The Shape of Water speaks to our need for connection and understanding. To start, we have to briefly mention Creature from the Black Lagoon, the classic black and white monster horror flick, complete with a routinely screaming lady. If you've never seen it, it follows a group of scientists searching for fossils in the Amazon that could provide the link between land and sea animals. But they soon encounter an amphibious humanoid creature who's very much alive. The creature evidently feels his home is being threatened and periodically kills crew members before getting captured and then escaping. He also develops a fixation on the leading lady and abducts her. During her rescue, the creature is shot multiple times and hobbles out to the Black Lagoon, sinking into the water before floating motionlessly in its murky depths. Seemingly dead, but it had 2 sequels, so I guess not. A 6-year-old Guillermo del Toro, the writer-director of The Shape of Water, watched this film under the impression that the monster and leading lady would fall in love in the end.
This vision of Julie Adams swimming over the Gilman in Creature from the Black Lagoon, and I thought that's the most beautiful image I've ever seen. And I really, at age 6, I really thought they're going to end well. They're going to end up together. It was the first time I saw it, and when it ended really, really bad, I thought I gotta correct this.
I don't really see how baby Guillermo misinterpreted it, seeing as they played loud, ominous music every time the monster appeared. Still, he came away from it feeling he was robbed of a romantic ending. I describe all this to say that to understand The Shape of Water, you have to understand the kind of person Guillermo del Toro is. I always joke that I really identify with that Drew Barrymore lookalike from Mean Girls who doesn't even go here.
I wish that I could bake a cake made out of rainbows and smiles and we'd all eat it, be happy.
She doesn't even go here!
And I feel like Del Toro also operates on this wavelength. Every project he's been involved in has been deeply personal to him, and he's a pretty good-natured and sentimental person. If you haven't watched his work, I highly recommend these other films. And I'm really looking forward to his stop-motion version of Pinocchio, not to be confused with Disney's upcoming live-action version, and Nightmare Alley, which is coming out this December. He was also originally supposed to direct The Hobbit, and I'm forever heartbroken it fell through. He's always had an affinity towards fantasy and fairy tales, a little bit fantastic and a little bit horrific, and he infuses magical realism into very real-life context, believing that fairy tales aren't realistic, but they are authentic.
Most people think fairy tales were born to be told to kids, but fairy tales were mostly done to entertain adults and to mostly talk about times that were very difficult. Famine, pestilence, war. If you think about the opening of Hansel and Gretel, where 2 parents are taking their 2 kids to die in the woods because they cannot feed them. That's you won't pitch that to Disney these days, you know?
Through his masterful storytelling, there's this sort of disarming sensitivity and rejection of cynicism that shines through each time, as he unfolds stories that are always ultimately about empathy. Even Pacific Rim, the action-packed sci-fi flick with massive robots, is actually a story about all of humanity coming together and people literally connecting through memories and experiences. I'm not big on romance stories alone, and thankfully that's not all the film's about. He sets the tale of The Shape of Water in 1962, during the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War, when fear of the other was especially heightened.
This creature is intelligent, capable of language, of understanding emotions.
So are the Soviets.
And we still kill them, don't we?
Del Toro often grounds his tales in historical context, either to creatively examine society's past mistakes or to note how little our mistakes have changed over the decades. He's especially skeptical when people gripe about how much has changed since the good old days. In an interview with the National News, he said they're actually talking about an America which never existed. In 1962, everything was idealized about the future, but it was a future that never really came to be. So The Shape of Water is not a movie about 1962. It's a movie that tells you that the racism, classism, sexual mores, everything that was alive in 62 is all alive now. It never went away.
There was all these things underneath that smiling facade of a barbecue in the suburbs, and it's today. It's very, very connected to today. Now, if I talk about it, and if I set the movie in today, what happens is what happens in conversations right now. We are beyond words right now. We are beyond truth. An argument can be made very smart, very cynically, about both sides really quickly and disarticulate the dialogue.
And so he uses the film's main characters to remark on the experiences of those who have been historically othered. We come to know the protagonist Eliza, a mute woman, her friends Giles, a pre-Stonewall gay man, and Zelda, a black woman. Eliza lives her life in routine, but it's important to note she's not sad or lonely. Much like her friends, Eliza just feels as though she doesn't fit in a world that views her as an outsider because of her differences. So when she meets the Amazonian river monster that's being studied by the lab she cleans at, she's drawn to him through recognition rather than curiosity. I'll get to the details of his character a little bit later though. Eliza's role was written specifically for Sally Hawkins after Del Toro watched her in Fingersmith. Impressed with how her character falls in love with another woman, and there's no perverse titillation or luridness. It just is. He would approach the love story here in the same way, and for him, the creature isn't an actual animal, but a representation of otherness.
I make no sound like him. What does that make me?
Eliza fell in love organically, with the sense that she was finally being understood as a complete person.
The way he looks at me, he does not know what I lack or how I am incomplete.
And her perceived inability to fully express this love is what led to this imagined musical dance number, with Eliza communicating her love in the way that made the most sense to her, in the way she wished she could. Her falling in love with a fish monster feels ridiculous at face value, but it's nevertheless wholeheartedly sincere.
He sees me for what I am, as I am.
And yes, she got that fish dick. I gotta say, watching Sally Hawkins succinctly describe the function of a cloaca is probably one of the film's many highlights. And if you can get past the weirdness of it all, you gotta admit Doug Jones made an incredible looking fish man.
In this suit design, because that ass was so yummy, best ass I've ever had. Unfortunately, I had to give it back every day, but...
Or maybe you never thought it was weird and fully embrace monster f***ing. All power to you. Guillermo's infiltrating the industry and making your dreams come true. I get the feeling most people wouldn't even blink if this was about a guy wanting to get with a mermaid instead, but I digress. Anyhow, there's a theory that Eliza was a fish person all along, based on a few aspects of her character. To name a few examples, as a baby, she was found orphaned near a river. She's always been mute, she has dreams about being underwater and feels most comfortable in water, and most significantly, the scars on her neck are transformed into gills at the end of the film. Her apartment even gives the sense that she's living in an aquarium, with dark hues of blue-green and a subtle recreation of the Great Wave off Kanagawa painted on her wall. Eliza's origins were left purposefully ambiguous, as was the ending. The film was bookended by Giles' narrations, and some of his final words give the impression that this is his imagined happy ending for the couple.
That they lived happily ever after? I believe they did. That they remained in love? I'm sure that's true.
But considering Del Toro tends to have a more optimistic stance about this sort of thing, I'm going to err on the side of magical realism and assume Eliza really did sprout gills and lived happily ever after with her fish man. Speaking of Giles, his arc involved grappling with the sense that he didn't mesh well with any generation, born too early for his sexuality to be accepted, born too late for his style of artistry.
Sometimes I think I was either born too early or too late for my life. Maybe we're both just relics.
At first, he was the kind of person quick to wave off the plight of others because he felt powerless.
Oh, dear God, change that awfulness. I do not want to see that. Now, does this mean that whenever we go to a Chinese restaurant, you want to save every fish in the tank?
So what if he's alone?
We're all alone.
What are we? What are you and I? Do you know what we are? We're nothing. Nothing. We can do nothing.
But he eventually came to accept that doing what you can be enough. In a similar vein, Zelda was hesitant to go along with Eliza's plan to rescue the monster. But in her day-to-day life, whether at work or in her marriage, she struggled with being heard and respected.
You're sitting right here, just 10 feet away from it.
My back's aching me, wanting to move.
Like Giles, she found agency through helping Eliza save the fish man from the facility. So in the end, this band of disenfranchised misfits came together to help a fellow outcast in a compassionate act of solidarity. A common complaint about the film is that it's too obvious, too in your face with its messaging and predictable in its execution. And I'm not sure I agree that subtext is always better than plain old text. It hasn't always worked out well when writers get caught up in the notion that predictable means bad. Convoluted or confusing storylines, or swerving for the sake of subverting expectations, aren't inherently better approaches than simplistic ones. The film wears its heart on its sleeve, and I'm personally fine with that, at least every once in a while. For example, some critics felt Michael Shannon's character was one-dimensional, and on the surface Strickland is somewhat of a villainous archetype. He even carries around a cattle prod, reminiscent of police who terrorized civil rights demonstrators at the time.
I wouldn't notice that. I don't know what it looks like.
Well, human, Zelda, he looks like a human, like me. Or even you. Maybe a little more like me, I guess.
His character was born from Del Toro's desire to upend the monster versus hero paradigm.
What I did in the beginning is I tried to follow form to have a basis, and I took the paradigm of a 1950s movie, the hero, the square-jawed agent from the government with an impeccable suit and a gun, who would have been the hero back then. Here is the antagonist. And the image, for example, of the creature carrying the girl, which is an image of horror in the 50s, is here an image of beauty. You know, and then you take all those cues and you turn them on their head.
Strickland is a caricature of American exceptionalism, with a perfect nuclear family and suburban home, a shiny new Cadillac, and grandiose speeches detailing rigid parameters about what it means to be a man.
A man washes his hands before or after tending to his needs. He does it both times, points to a weakness in character.
His character speaks to the notion that nationalism is often grounded in delusion or misunderstandings, and that people who pretend things were ever great for everyone are sweeping the ugly parts of our history under the proverbial rug. But even he isn't evil just for the sake of it. He's a person desperately trying to hold on to an illusion of superiority.
I do not fail. I deliver.
While clearly unhappy in his home life and yearning for bigger and better things, striving to live up to the expectations placed on him, seemingly at any cost.
When is a man done, sir, proving himself a good man, a decent man?
His desperation for perfection is further demonstrated by him keeping his severed, rotting fingers attached to his hand, which is also a gruesome example of an effort to not let his perceived inferior win against him. But when he's finally confronted with the power of the amphibian man on a level playing field, he's humbled at last.
You are a god.
Of this moment, Del Toro said, "I believe that we get this clarity in the last minute of our life. The titles we achieved, the honors we managed, they all vanish. You are left alone with you and your deeds and the things you didn't do. And that moment of clarity gives you either peace or the most tremendous fear, because you finally have no cover, and you finally realize exactly who you are." Speaking of this scene, Del Toro likens the amphibian man to biblical stories of the humble Messiah, a common narrative I for some reason remember most vividly from the end of Bruce Almighty, where the homeless man who appears periodically throughout the film ends up being God himself, suitably played by Morgan Freeman.
The idea of the Messiah that comes in rags to be tortured and put through pain and then reveals at the end as a true Messiah, which is incredibly moving, and it's very close to fairy tales.
It's easy for most of us to sympathize with characters like Eliza and Zelda and Giles, but this fish monster as a romantic lead, that's evidently harder to do. So I think it's important to further examine the creature as a reversal of the classic movie monster. It's no coincidence that the original fishman from the 50s lived in the exotic Amazon, and his victims were almost exclusively the more primitive South American crew members. This monster is an other, in an other sort of place, and kills off other sort of people who are viewed as expendable. Just like the original King Kong, as far as cultural and sociological implications, there's more to the monster than meets the eye. But in the shape of water, instead of being killed by his enemies' bullets, the monster heals his wounds and lives up to the awe-inspiring reputation of an Amazonian river god. And he gets the girl.
We are made, many of us are made of a thinner glass than regular people. And we resonate with the world in a way that is more delicate and more painful in many ways than your regular impulse. And I think that we feel outcasts, no matter what. You can have a mini scar. You can be too dark, too light, too tall, too thin, too fat. Whatever it is that you have, you feel that outcast. And I think the monsters, you start pouring that empathy to them. And that's what happened to me.
The humble messiah trope isn't the only aspect bringing religious undertones to the film. In fact, Del Toro compares the intermingling of monsters and religion in his stories to the syncretism that took place when Spanish colonists invaded what is now Mexico.
We grabbed the dogma of Catholic and we took our elder myths and we married them together and made something syncretic of that. That's what happened to me with the Catholic religion and monsters and fantasy and fairy tales. I joined them, fused them.
Del Toro describes himself as a lapsed Catholic, and remnants of his Catholic upbringing often seep into his work, including direct references. Notably, his history with Catholicism is a major reason he felt like an outcast as a child growing up in Mexico. His grandmother actually tried to exorcise him with holy water, twice, because of his interests in fantasy and horror. It evidently had the opposite effect, because he developed a sort of kinship with and admiration of monsters.
And they became spiritual and representations of spiritual virtues, of concepts, and my spiritual cosmology is made of these creatures. They don't represent what they represent to a normal person. I am an abnormal bastard. And there was a moment that was very religious for me when Boris Karloff as the creature comes to the threshold in Frankenstein. I was moved to tears. I was like, I saw the Messiah. I saw a Christ-like figure full of suffering.
Like Del Toro, I feel some people gravitate to stories about monsters because we identify with their experience. It's not rare for groups or individuals to be judged as monstrous or otherwise dehumanized for traits they can't change. That's why Del Toro said, "As a kid, I knew that monsters were far more gentle and more desirable than the monsters living inside quote-unquote nice people. And I think accepting that you are a monster gives you the leeway to not behave like one. It's a very simple paradox that you understand when you find that tool to allow yourself to stop hating yourself. There are truths about oneself that are really bad and hard to admit, but when you finally have the courage and say them, you liberate yourself, and monsters are a personification of that." Along with these biblical parallels, there are more obvious comparisons like Beauty and the Beast. Del Toro wanted to take out the parts of Beauty and the Beast he didn't like. Namely, he wanted the leading lady to be imperfect, and wanted to remove the Beast transformation from the equation.
The Beast doesn't need to transform to be loved. You know, it doesn't have to turn into a boring fucking prince to be loved or renounce to the essence of who it is. Because to me, love is not transformation. Love is acceptance and understanding.
So I feel the story, despite its strangeness, has a form of purity in spirit and ardent sincerity that's difficult to pull off in this context. The point of Eliza and the amphibian man falling in love isn't that romance can complete you. It's that offering understanding and goodwill is the purest form of love, regardless of who it's being offered to. There's a reason the screenplay was originally titled A Fairy Tale for Troubled Times. Del Toro said, "I find that we can talk about anything cynical or skeptic, and it sounds super intelligent, but the risk now, the really risky thing is to be emotional. We're very guarded, we're very afraid of emotions, and I wanted to make an emotional movie movie. A movie that was like a healing tonic for the skepticism and the rage that I think we have socially, and the way we look at each other with suspicion.
Because we live in a time where we demonize the other. We are told we gotta fear it. Ideologies are telling us everywhere, constantly, why we have to divide the world in us and them. Whether it's race, religion, geographical provenance, sexual preference, gender, anything creates these fake divisions of us and them, and there's only us. There's only us. There's not them. Them is a concept that's created to control us, to make us afraid of each other, and the movie tries to embody that concept of the other in this creature. The beauty of the other.
I know all this isn't as easy as just joining our hands and singing Kumbaya, but in the same way water takes the shape it needs to fit the conditions, love can do the same. Thanks for watching. If you couldn't tell, this was actually supposed to be our last video for Halloween month, but better late than never. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts on The Shape of Water or Guillermo del Toro's work in general. I've always really appreciated his unique approach to storytelling, so I'm interested to know what you think. I'll see y'all next time. Peace.